it's Margot, and today I'm beginning a new series on the unfortunate endings of far too many of Playboy's models, a phenomenon that's been dubbed the Centerfold Curse, or the Playboy Curse. I'm sure you won't want to miss this one, so keep watching. Many of the deaths of the women who have posed for Playboy have been gruesome, premature, and shrouded in mystery. These deaths have spanned nearly 6 decades, from 1962 until the most recent in 2020. There have been no less than 20 Playboy centerfolds that have died before the age of 50, though if this is indeed a curse, it's not limited to centerfolds. This information by itself may not sound all that strange or alarming, but it works out to approximately 2.85% of the women who have graced the centerfold spread of the magazine. If 0.7% of Americans tend to die between the ages of 20 and 50, that would mean that Playboy's rates are about 400% higher than the national average. Of course, this isn't entirely mathematically accurate without further comparisons, but it's certainly something to take into consideration. It would be interesting to compare Playboy's death rate to that of all Hollywood celebrities under the age of 50, but for now, we're exploring this small subset. It's also interesting that most of these deaths occurred in similar ways. Researching this is like hearing the same stories over and over again, but they're also very interesting and tragic individually. These are 2 of those stories, of those whose lives were prematurely ended, by murder specifically. I warn you that the details of these crimes are horrific, disturbing, and definitely may be triggering to some. We'll begin with the infamous murder of Dorothy Stratten. I've previously spoken briefly about Dorothy on this channel, but you can't discuss Playboy-related murders without revisiting this one, so let's do a bit of a deeper dive here. Dorothy Stratten, born Dorothy Ruth Hoog Stratten, was born on February 28, 1960, in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. She grew up in what's described as a rough neighborhood, and had planned to become a secretary after high school. When she was just 17 years old, she was working part-time at a Vancouver Dairy Queen to help her cafeteria worker mother make ends meet. This is where she met 26-year-old Paul Snyder. Snyder also grew up in Vancouver. He was a bodybuilder, nightclub and car show promoter, and purported pimp. He's described as a flashy dresser and a wannabe star, who drove a Mercedes with a license plate that read Star 80. He was convinced Dorothy's beauty could make him rich and famous. Regardless of her being underage, the 2 quickly became a couple, much to Dorothy's mother's disapproval. Soon, Snyder convinced Dorothy to allow a photographer to take nude pictures of her, which were sent to Playboy magazine in the summer of 1978. Since she was under the age of 19, the legal age of majority in British Columbia, Dorothy had to persuade her mother to sign the model release form. Dorothy then moved to Los Angeles, shortened her last name to Stratten, and was chosen as a finalist for Playboy's 25th anniversary Great Playmate Hunt. When she first arrived at the Playboy mansion, Dorothy was described as very shy and naive. It's said that she was very uncomfortable with the casual nudity that surrounded her. It's rumored that several playmates befriended Dorothy and protected her from the older guys hanging around the mansion, whom they considered to be predators. But they couldn't protect her from all of them. Snyder soon joined Dorothy in LA, and they were married shortly thereafter. During this time, Dorothy was working as a bunny at the Century City Playboy Club and became Playboy's August 1979 Playmate of the Month. She'd caught the attention of Playboy's founder and editor Hugh Hefner, who felt she could have success as an actress, possibly even being seen as the next Marilyn Monroe. Dorothy did start having some success in Hollywood. She was featured in episodes of the TV series Buck Rogers and Fantasy Island in 1979. That same year, she also had small roles in the films Americathon and roller disco comedy Skate Town, and had the lead role in the exploitation film Autumn Born. Dorothy was also named 1980's Playmate of the Year and made a couple more movies at that time. Everything seemed to be going her way, career-wise at least. Everyone was certain that the shy and well-liked beauty had a very bright future ahead of her. While all of Dorothy's work was close to home, Snyder took on the role of her chauffeur, manager, and acting coach. His constant presence and criticism caused Dorothy so much stress that her co-workers at Playboy and on movie sets were very much aware of the tension in the relationship. As her success grew, Hefner encouraged Dorothy to cut ties with Snyder, calling him a hustler and a pimp. Friends also warned Dorothy about the warning signs they were seeing in Snyder's behavior. In March of 1980, Dorothy flew to New York City to begin work on her latest film project, a romantic comedy starring Ben Gazzara, John Ritter, and Audrey Hepburn, called They All Laughed, which was written and directed by Peter Bogdanovich. This was her first substantial role in a big-budget movie. Knowing the trouble Snyder could cause on set, Dorothy convinced him to stay in Los Angeles, telling him the director had decided to close the movie set to all but the cast and immediate crew. During the filming, Dorothy and Bogdanovich began having an affair. In April of 1980, Dorothy briefly returned to LA to perform her Playmate of the Year duties. During this time, she did a promotional tour for Playboy and appeared on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. During the Canadian leg of her promotional tour, she wrote a letter to Snyder asking for more freedom in their relationship. Upon receiving it, Snyder flew into a rage over the phone. He then flew to Vancouver, where Dorothy had planned to spend a few days relaxing with her family before going back to New York to finish filming. During this time in Vancouver, Snyder insisted Dorothy make personal appearances at several local nightclubs, pocketing all of the appearance fees. The couple argued heatedly, and Dorothy offered to give up her acting career to save their marriage, suggesting they move back to Canada. But Snyder was having none of that. Of course, he wouldn't want to give up the potential millions he could pocket from his wife's fame. Dorothy returned to filming in New York City, and Snyder returned to LA. In late June of 1980, just a few weeks after their first wedding anniversary, Snyder received a letter from his wife announcing that they were now physically and financially separated. Snyder reacted by draining their joint bank account, having an affair with an old girlfriend, and hiring private detective Mark Goldstein to prove that Dorothy was having an affair with Bogdanovich. As a Canadian citizen living in the U.S. without a green card, Snyder had no source of income other than Dorothy's. He completely relied on her to pay the household bills. Since that also meant he had no money to pay the private detective, he began selling off Dorothy's Playmate of the Year prizes at a loss for quick cash, the most notable being a Jaguar sports car that Playboy had valued at $26,000. On July 30th, 1980, Dorothy and Bogdanovich returned to Los Angeles after wrapping up filming and spending a 10-day holiday together in England. Dorothy quietly moved into Bogdanovich's Bel Air mansion while claiming to reside at her own newly rented Beverly Hills apartment, which was actually occupied by Bogdanovich's personal assistant. But of course Snyder, thanks to his hired investigator, was aware that Dorothy was living with her new boyfriend. He showed up outside of the director's estate on July 31st, carrying a borrowed handgun, intending to shoot anyone who appeared at the entrance to the property. After several hours with no activity, Snyder grew impatient and left. He later admitted to a friend that he'd had thoughts of suicide that night. At noon on Friday, August 8th, Dorothy met up with Snyder for the first time in nearly 3 months at Snyder's West LA house that they'd formerly shared. Snyder was confident he could convince his wife to take him back, but instead she told him that she'd fallen in love with Bogdanovich and wanted to finalize their divorce. They agreed to meet again the following week to discuss a monetary settlement. That same day, Snyder had to return the borrowed gun to its owner, but over the next few days he became obsessed with getting another. The day after his meeting with Dorothy, on August 9th, Snyder and Goldstein went to a local gun store. After being informed they couldn't sell him a gun because of his Canadian citizenship, Snyder asked Goldstein to buy the gun for him. The detective declined. The following day, Snyder tried to convince Goldstein to buy him a machine gun for, quote, home protection. Again, the detective declined. The next day after that, on August 11th, Snyder went to look at a gun he'd found for sale in a newspaper, but lost his way. He eventually gave up and went home. On August 13th, Snyder managed to purchase a used 12-gauge pump-action shotgun from a private seller he'd found in a local classified ad. Later that evening, Snyder told friends about the gun and cryptically stated he was going to take up hunting. During that same conversation, Snyder casually brought up the subject of playmates who had unexpectedly died, and specifically how those deaths had caused problems for the magazine, such as causing Playboy's editors to have to pull photos of the dead playmate from the next issue if there was time. Just days earlier, Hefner had banned Snyder from the Playboy mansion unless he was accompanied by Dorothy. On August 14, 1980, Dorothy arrived at Snyder's house at noon for their scheduled divorce negotiation. Earlier that day, Dorothy had conferred with her business manager about what to offer Snyder in the divorce settlement. The manager suggested that she avoid spending any more time with Snyder by handing off the negotiations to a lawyer. Dorothy replied that the process would go easier if she dealt with Snyder personally, explaining that he was being nice about everything. She added, "I'd like to remain his friend." The people closest to Dorothy were concerned about her meeting with Snyder by herself. Nobody knows exactly what happened when Dorothy and Snyder were alone that day, but by 8 o'clock that evening, Snyder's two roommates, Stephen Kushner and Patty Lorman, had returned to the house. They saw Dorothy's car parked in the driveway, noticed that Snyder's bedroom door was closed, and assumed the couple had reconciled and wanted their privacy. The roommates spent the next several hours watching TV in the living room. Shortly after 11 p.m., the roommates heard Snyder's phone ringing with no answer, and realized they hadn't heard any noise from the room since they'd been home. Finally, they decided to see if everything was okay. Upon entering the bedroom, they discovered the bodies of Dorothy and Snyder. Each had been killed by a single blast to the head from Snyder's shotgun. Both were nude. The gun was found beneath Snyder's body. According to the police timeline, Snyder had shot Dorothy in the face that afternoon, within an hour of her arrival at the house. At some point, he'd apparently strapped her to what's been described as a love contraption, a homemade bondage rack, and sexually assaulted her. It's unclear whether he did this before or after he killed her. I've seen some pretty graphic descriptions and photos of the crime scene, but I don't think that's necessary here. Snyder then shot himself. It's believed that Snyder killed himself about 1 hour after murdering his ex-wife. Sometime after midnight, in the early morning of August 15th, the private detective phoned the Playboy mansion and told Mr. Hefner that Dorothy had been murdered. Hefner then called Bogdanovich, who collapsed at the news and had to be sedated. In an odd follow-up, in 1988, at the age of 49, Bogdanovich married Dorothy's sister Louise, then 20. They divorced in 2001 after being married for 13 years. He also wrote a book published in 1984 about Dorothy and his relationship with her, along with a scathing attack on Hugh Hefner. I won't go into detail considering there's really no way of verifying the allegations made in the book, but the title is The Killing of the Unicorn, Dorothy Stratten, 1960 to 1980, if anyone's interested. Dorothy's mother was told of her daughter's death at her home later that morning by an officer of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Dorothy Stratten was only 20 years old. Her body was cremated and the remains interred at the Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery in Los Angeles. Immortalized in songs like Californication by the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Dead Meat by Bush, The Best Was Yet to Come by Bryan Adams, and CoverGirl by Prism, along with 2 movies and the aforementioned book inspired by her, Dorothy Stratten's brief life and fleeting time in the spotlight has certainly left a lasting impression. Our next purported victim of the Playboy Curse sort of began and ended in the same places as Dorothy Stratten, but they took totally different roads in between. Ellen Louise Stowe, who went by Star, was named Playboy's Playmate of the Month in February of 1977. Star was born on March 19, 1956 in Little Rock, Arkansas, and grew up in Arkansas, Louisiana, and Nevada, with dreams of being a dancer. As a teenager, she moved to Las Vegas and later to Los Angeles. Playboy lore states that she got her nickname when she couldn't get into a nightclub because she was underage. In response, a bouncer quoted the Rolling Stones song Star, Star, supposedly because he could tell she was going to be famous. That makes me wonder if the people at Playboy had ever actually listened to that song. And because Star also had a fascination with the night sky, the name stuck. Star was later discovered by a Playboy talent scout while dancing in a strip club in Los Angeles. She was the first Playmate with a visible tattoo, a big blue star below her bikini line. At around this time, Star met Kiss bassist Gene Simmons at the elevators of the Hotel Sahara in Las Vegas, and they dated for a while. During this time, Star posed for various publicity photos with the band. Though it certainly became more common in subsequent years, the combination of Playboy Playmate and rockstar girlfriend was still a novelty in 1977 and garnered a lot of attention for the couple. Star found herself moving in celebrity circles for a short while. The years following her Playboy spread ultimately were far from kind to Star, though. Her relationship with Simmons seemingly ended as suddenly as it began, when he allegedly moved on to dating music legend Cher. Sometime after this, Star married a man named Peter Maligo. They had a son, Michael Maligo, and later divorced. When Michael was 6 years old, Star sent him to live with her mother in Little Rock, but they still stayed in touch through frequent visits and weekly phone calls. Michael later said in interviews that his mom was like a best friend to him. "I thought she was so cool," he said. "I really enjoyed being around her." Star went back to exotic dancing, then moved to Fort Lauderdale, Florida in 1986, where she fell into drugs, alcohol, and obscurity. In the beginning, her Playboy credentials ensured she'd be able to find jobs at decent strip clubs, but that seemed to be the only residual perk from her brief brush with fame, and even that didn't last long enough. Star's hard partying lifestyle, addictions, and competition from younger, healthier dancers led to her turning to prostitution to make ends meet by the early 1990s. Her clients didn't even recognize her as the vibrant young quasi-celebrity she'd once been. In 1991, things seemed to be looking up for Star when she moved in with a boyfriend, giving up drugs and prostitution. He'd promised to financially support her so she wouldn't have to go back to that risky lifestyle. During this time, Star cared for the couple's animals, cleaned house, and tended their garden. Sadly, this only lasted until August of 1996, when the couple split up following a drunken argument. Star then went back to her former life on the streets. Star was last seen alive, working the streets in her old neighborhood between 3 p.m. and 5 p.m. on March 16, 1997. Her body was later found by some boys, strangled and partially clothed, discarded behind an Eckerd pharmacy in Coral Springs, Florida. Police believed she was picked up by someone posing as a client, killed, and then dumped sometime after 5 p.m. on the 16th. This was 3 days before her 41st birthday. Another Fort Lauderdale sex worker, Sandra K. Walters, had been found dead under similar circumstances a couple weeks earlier. Later in 1997, another woman named Tammy Strunk was found strangled and dumped in a shopping center trash bin in Plantation, Florida. Before the year's end, a woman named Teresa Kettner was found killed in the same fashion in Coral Springs, Florida. At that point, police had to admit they probably were dealing with a serial killer. 2 more women turned up murdered in the same manner in 1999. By then, police were pretty certain these victims were all killed by the same perpetrator. But then the crimes just stopped and the trail went cold. Star's son Michael has said his fondest memories of his mom were playing board and video games and eating the beef stir-fry she made. The last time he talked to her was nearly 2 weeks before her death. They talked about some new bands she'd heard and how she liked the new 9 Inch Nails album. Michael had been aware of his mother's lifestyle, but it wasn't something they talked about. He was 14 when she died. Star was cremated and her ashes given to her mother. Star Stowe's murder, as well as the murders of the other women, taken so brutally by seemingly the same perpetrator, remain unsolved. Whether you believe in the Centerfold curse or feel that posing for Playboy affected these women in any negative way, I think we can all agree that nobody deserves the ghastly endings these 2 ladies came to. That's all I have for you today. I hope you found these stories interesting and will come back for part 2. Like, subscribe, leave a comment, and bring your friends, family, COVID pod, cult members, invisible friends, or enemies. And if you have any thoughts on this topic, leave them in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.